There are a number of items that I want to mention before I begin my sermon this morning. And most of these, I think maybe all of them are in the bulletin, but we're up against a couple of deadlines, so I want to mention them to you. First of all is, I mentioned last week, and I know we kind of got late notice giving you this, but the church golf tournament will be 2 weeks from yesterday, September 23rd. Now, they've changed the policy out at the golf course because they're under new ownership. We have to give them a commitment of 20 people 2 weeks beforehand, or we have to pay for it. I don't want to pay for it, and I don't think Jacob does either. So we need a commitment today, okay? Lots of times people wait till the last minute. If we don't have 20 commitments today, we will have to cancel the golf tournament. You don't have to pay today. So there's forms out in the foyer. If you would just fill one of those out and give them to me or Jacob so that we can go forward with that. Another thing I wanted to mention is those of you who were a part of the Wednesday night when we were in the family room watching the movie, The Shack, it broke down with about 45 minutes left. So we're going to pick up again this week with watching the rest of that, and I kind of hate that because it builds the emotion all the way through the movie. But that is, we're going to deal with it as we can. I need you there as close to 7 o'clock as you can, though, because we really need to get started right away. The other deadline we're up against is today is the day that you need to, if you want to take part in the giving toward the disaster relief from Hurricane Harvey, we need that today, and that check will then be, all of them will be compiled and sent to Serving God, Serving Others, who are on the ground in that area right now. So if you could give your check to Joy, are you here, Joy? Okay, to Joy or to me or one of the elders, and we will get that to the people, or we'll get that and compile it, okay? But we really need that today as well. And I appreciate Jacob mentioning or praying about the hurricane. Right now, as we're sitting here, Florida is being devastated, and so we need to keep those people in our prayers as well. So, we're back to our study of Ecclesiastes. If you'd be opening your Bibles, if you would like to follow along. I meant to run this by some of our pilots here. This congregation, man, we have got the pilot. How many of you have a pilot's license? Yeah, we've got a lot more that do too. I don't see David Fuller. David's not here, is he? Okay. Spatial disorientation is something that happens to pilots when their plane enters into a thick cloud bank or into a thick fog, and it makes it where they can't see the horizon, they can't see the ground, and you can no longer even be sure of which way's up and which way's down. And the only way that a pilot can overcome spatial disorientation is to trust their instruments, to trust their cockpit instruments. And so flight training instructors force student pilots to learn to fly only by their instruments. And I'm told that the toughest part of earning a certification is learning how to put unquestioning faith in your instruments, even when your eyes and your head are telling you something different. Similarly, when it comes to our faith, and we don't understand what's going on in our lives, and our lives have been turned upside down so that we can't figure out which way's up and which way's down, we have got to learn to fly by our instruments. We don't abandon our faith just because we can't figure things out. We trust in these moments. We trust in what we know, not in how we feel. That's flying by instruments. And so in Ecclesiastes, the preacher, again, Solomon, I believe to be the preacher, teaches us how to survive in this fallen world. A world that he refers to oftentimes throughout this letter as life under the sun. And as we come to chapter 8, he shows us that faith endures even when faith doesn't understand. Even when life is unfair. Even when God doesn't give us all the answers. We must trust God is in control of those things that we don't understand. Paul wrote this in Romans chapter 11 and verse 33. He said, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable His judgments and His paths beyond tracing out." Now I want you to consider this as you look at that verse. Paul stood head and shoulders over his peers when it came to intellectual ability. He was brilliant. He was one of the most well-educated men of his day. He was well-traveled. And he was not a stranger of pain or hardship or trial. And yet Paul does not hesitate to tell us that some things of God are unsearchable. Some things of God are beyond tracing out. So, what do we do with mystery? How do we deal with questions that defy explanation? Well, to be able to do that, we've got to fall back on what we talked about last week. It involves humility and wisdom. And in this section we're going to look at today, the preacher gives us 2 points of advice as to how to live with this humility and wisdom. The first thing he says is to respect human authority. He begins in chapter 8. Go back to that last one. It's got the first line of the verse on it. There, yeah, thank you. He says, "Who is like the wise? Who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes its hard appearance. Obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, 'What are you doing?'" Now, this is interesting because here is a king, Solomon, writing to us about how to get along with a king. And I would guess, maybe it's just my own perspective, but it seems like respect for authority is about at the lowest ebb that it's ever been. And add to that the fact that we are Americans, and America was birthed in revolution to overthrow what? Authority. And so it's kind of, it's almost ingrained in our culture. And yet the deeper question that I think that we need to deal with here is this. How do we live in, how do we interact in a world in which everything is tainted? Because everything is broken. Where the DNA of the universe is fractured so that not only are we all sinners, but every institution that we can be involved in is made up of sinners. It's made up of broken, fallen people. The preacher's advice is, be careful to whom you submit. Because once you commit to that, you become a part of that. And if you're not careful, you can get pulled away from what is right. So be careful to whom you give influence. Then he says this in verse 5. "Whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighted down with misery." Generally speaking, if you obey the law, you won't get in trouble. And so if you obey the law, for instance, if you're driving the speed limit, there is absolutely no reason that you need a fuzzbuster. If you're driving the speed limit, there's no reason to get all scared every time you see a highway patrolman sitting on the side of the highway. It amazes me. People will go zipping by me, and then there's a highway patrolman. They slow down to 40. Don't you think that highway patrolman knows these people are guilty? They're just faking it right now. Nobody drives 40. But it seems like that happens. And if you're honest in paying your taxes, yes, you might get called in for an audit with the IRS, but there's no reason to be all alarmed by it, because if you've really been honest, then you don't have anything that you're going to be hiding. And if you do your job faithfully, you don't have to worry about if the boss is watching you or not. And so the advice that Solomon's giving us here is save yourself a lot of worry and just obey the laws, obey the rules of the job. And then he goes on to say this: since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what is to come? As no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death. And as no one is discharged in time of war, so wickedness will not release those who practice it. All this I saw as I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There is a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. This is a general summation of the human condition. The preacher reminds us that we don't have any control over some of the most basic elements of life. Right now, that massive hurricane is hitting Florida, and there is nothing anybody can do about it. Not to stop it, not to control it. And when it comes to the day of our death, none of us have any control over that. And most of us don't have anything to do with controlling whether there's war or not. And sadly, he reminds us that even when we do have some level of authority, unfortunately, what we often do is use that authority to hurt other people. And then the preacher finds himself at a funeral. He says this in verse 10. Then too I saw the wicked buried. Those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too is meaningless. Do you get the idea that he's kind of ticked about this? There's an amazing thing about funerals. Shakespeare, in his play Julius Caesar, he borrowed from Euripides, who was an early Greek playwright. And Euripides, he puts the words into a person who is speaking praise about Julius Caesar. And this is what he said: the evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones. The preacher says nearly exactly the opposite. Because what the preacher says is that we often forget the bad things people do when we come to the time of their funeral. You've all experienced this, haven't you? You've been to a funeral and you're sitting there listening to the eulogy and you think, man, I better check my program. I might be at the wrong funeral. That doesn't sound anything like the person I knew. And this bothered the preacher. And then he begins to segue, though, into his second point. When here he talks about respect divine authority. He says this in verse 11. When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. Some people seem to think that since God doesn't immediately and dramatically punish sin, that it's okay to sin. I mean, think about it. We tell our young people that sin has consequences. And yet they know people who are having illicit sex outside of marriage or living together outside of marriage, and yet their lives aren't falling apart and they're not getting venereal disease or AIDS and so they see, well, there's no immediate consequence for it, so it must be okay. Or we tell them dishonesty doesn't pay. Cheaters never prosper. And yet they know of people who have cheated at stuff and they get by with it. In fact, they might even have a positive outcome from their cheating. And since there is no immediate consequence, then they conclude, well, it must be okay. But here the preacher sees the common criminal hanging out with the solid citizens as if he were one of them. And after a lifetime of sinful, corrupt behavior, he dies and he's buried, and everyone gets together and praises him. And the preacher doesn't like this. How does it pay then to be decent? And so he continues. Although a wicked person who commits 100 crimes may live a long time, I know that it will go better with those who fear God, who are reverent before Him. Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. In other words, appearances can be deceiving. The preacher knows that evil does not ultimately win. And the people of faith, we're not overwhelmed and dismayed by the mere appearance that sin goes unpunished, because we know better, don't we? We know there's going to be a day of reckoning. We know that there is going to be a time when wickedness is going to be exposed and sin is going to be punished. And so he says in verse 14, there's something else meaningless that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless. Here the preacher writes about the mystery of unfair consequences. And until God comes and makes all things whole and makes all things right and mends all that is broken, until that time, life on this earth, or as the preacher would say, life under the sun, is not going to be fair. It's not going to be just. Now, we as God's children ought to be a part of a kingdom that is breaking into this world and bringing fairness and justice, but it's still not going to be our experience until God remakes all things. The righteous are also often going to suffer in the short term, and the wicked are often going to prosper. In the movie The Shack, Mac, who is the main character in this book, in this movie, he is obsessed with some things that he does not understand. He keeps asking the question, in fact, accuses God by saying, how could you, who claim to be a loving God, allow my daughter to be murdered? And he just keeps coming back to this. It's like he's stuck there. And we don't know how to fully answer that, do we? It's a mystery. And so instead of trusting God and working through his pain, Mac just gets stuck right there. And for a while it seems he even abandons his faith. But I want you to consider this. If that's the choice that we make, we're still hurting. But now we have no hope. And so what can we do when we find ourselves on the wrong end of this upside down world? When we can't tell which end is up? We can trust God. And sometimes that sounds pretty trite, doesn't it? Just trust God. What does that mean? We trust in His faithfulness. We trust that He has always been a God who does what He says He will do, which means He will always be a God who does what He says He's going to do. And we trust that. And then the preacher reminds us again of how we ought to be living. I love it that he sprinkles this idea several times throughout the book. And here we have it again. He says, so I commend the enjoyment of life, because there's nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and to be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. In other words, don't let what you cannot control tomorrow ruin today. As I've said before, I do not believe that in saying things like this that the preacher is just advocating raw hedonism. No, I think we would do better to frame this, to read statements like this in this way. He's saying, experience the simplicity and contentment that comes from life's simple pleasures. Because we can't control everything. We can't control tomorrow. We can't understand everything. And so what are our options since we can't do that? Are we going to become cynical? Are we going to become bitter? No. His advice is, enjoy the moment. You've got this moment. Enjoy it right now. Trust God to take care of what you cannot take care of. And while you're at it, go out to your favorite restaurant and have a good meal. Eat and drink and be glad. I'm so glad he does this throughout this book, aren't you? And then he closes this section with these words. When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that's done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they cannot really comprehend it. Now remember, this is the wisest guy, next to Jesus, perhaps, who ever lived. And he's saying, I can't figure it all out. I've done my best. He discovered that he could not discover what he wanted to discover. God's great knowledge, God's immensity just overwhelmed him. So how are we to deal with life's mysteries? It's a good question. Imagine most of you have heard of Harry Houdini. He was a very popular character in our country, 100 plus years ago. And he was known for being able to escape from any situation he could be put in. Straitjackets, chains wrapped all around him. One of his biggest claims to fame, though, is he claimed that there was not a jail cell that could hold him. And he proved it over and over again. He would be put in a jail cell and the door would be locked, and once he got in there, he had this long, thin, strong piece of metal that he would pull out of his belt, and he would then begin to work on the lock, and in just a few moments he would come out. No one ever caught him. And so he did this. He was successful every time except once. He accepted an invitation to come to try and escape from a jail cell, and so he came. He was put in that cell. The door was shut behind him. And once he pulled out that piece of metal and he began going to work. This time something was wrong. He couldn't unlock the lock, and for 2 hours he applied himself to this with all of his skill and all of his experience, but he never heard that click. He never heard the tumblers fall into place. And so finally he gave up. You know what the problem was? That cell door had never been locked. He was trying to untumble a lock that was already unlocked. All he had to do is push the door open, and he could have left. The only place that door was locked was in Harry Houdini's mind. And in a similar way, sometimes faith is really hard for some of us. I confess to you, because I am a need-to-know kind of guy. I'm one of these guys like Solomon. I want to know the answers to everything. That there's simply some things that God has not chosen to reveal answers about. And we're never going to be able to fully resolve some things in this life. But as I said last week, do not think that that is any reflection on God. That is a reflection on our limitations, not on His. And we must never give up what we know for what we don't know. You see, like that jail cell, the door to faith is unlocked. The door to faith is open. And it's only locked in the minds of people who choose to think that it's locked. God wants us to rest in Him. God wants us to trust Him with those things that we cannot figure out. Don't let what you cannot understand destroy what you can enjoy and destroy what you know to be true. And so my advice today is that we stop striving, that we stop straining, that we return to what Jesus honored to begin with, which is to say, have a simple, trusting faith like a child trusts his parents. Trust God. Because God gets it. And I don't get it, but I get God. So we're going to sing an invitation song right now. And it's a song I want you to notice. It's a song where the writer expresses things we don't know, but also reminds us of the really important things that we do know. And if you need to respond to the invitation today, to come to be baptized, to come for prayer, to make your way to room 102 and pray with an elder and his wife, we encourage you right now to do that as we stand and sing.